Have you ever looked into a mirror and felt that something wasn't quite right? Maybe a movement in the reflection didn't match yours, or a shadow lingered where it shouldn't. I never thought much about these fleeting moments of unease, until I restored that mirror. I'm Elias Thorne, a restorer of antique artifacts, and this is the story of how I discovered the darkness hiding in plain sight. What began as a routine job became a nightmare I can never escape. But before we dive into the terrifying details, take a moment to subscribe to this channel and hit the like button. The stories I share here aren't for the faint of heart, and trust me, you'll want to hear every word because what happened to me could happen to anyone who dares to gaze into the unknown. It all started innocently enough. The mirror arrived in my workshop wrapped in layers of cloth, its frame ornate and impossibly old, carved with symbols I couldn't recognize. There was something about it, something unsettling. As I unwrapped it, the air around me grew colder, and the faint smell of burning wax filled the room, though no candles were lit. When I finally revealed the glass, my breath caught. It wasn't the mirror's beauty that struck me. It was the way it seemed to hum, as if alive, vibrating just below the range of hearing. The surface wasn't like any mirror I'd seen before. It reflected perfectly, yes, but there was a depth to it, as if it wasn't just a reflection but a window to somewhere else. Somewhere dark. That first night, I stayed late in the workshop, cleaning the mirror and repairing its frame. At some point, I realized I was being watched. I glanced around the room, my heart pounding, but I was alone, or so I thought. My eyes were drawn back to the mirror. For a moment, I swore I saw movement, not my own, but something in the background. A shadow, tall and still, lingered at the edge of the reflection. I froze, my breath hitching as cold sweat broke out on my skin. Slowly, I turned to look behind me, but there was nothing there, only the dim light of my workspace. When I turned back to the mirror, the shadow was gone. I told myself it was a trick of the light, exhaustion playing games with my mind. But as the hours passed, the feeling of unease grew stronger. Every time I looked at the mirror, I felt it watching me, not as an object, but as something sentient. That night, I locked the workshop and left, but the unease followed me home. Even as I tried to sleep, I couldn't shake the sensation of being observed, as though unseen eyes were fixed on me from every dark corner. Looking back, I realized that was the mirror's way of warning me, or perhaps it was already pulling me in. At the time, I didn't know that my life was about to change forever. What I saw in that mirror was just the beginning. And the shadow? It wasn't a trick of the light. It was something real, something alive, something waiting. If you've ever felt the darkness staring back at you from the other side of a mirror, stay with me. What I'm about to share will make you question every reflection you've ever seen. Subscribe, leave a like, and brace yourself. This is a story that will make you think twice before standing in front of a mirror alone. It all began on an ordinary night, or at least, it seemed that way at first. The mirror stood propped up in the corner of my workshop, its presence almost demanding attention. I had placed it there temporarily, but no matter where I went in the room, it felt as if it was watching me. That evening, I stayed late, the hum of my tools filling the air as I worked on a different restoration project. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that the mirror wanted me to look at it. I kept glancing at it, drawn to the shimmering surface that seemed unnaturally dark, as though it absorbed more light than it reflected. When the clock struck midnight, I decided to call it a night. But as I reached for the light switch, something in the mirror's reflection caught my eye. It wasn't my movement, but something behind me, indistinct but undeniably there. I froze, my hand hovering in midair, and turned slowly to check the room. The shadows in the corners seemed deeper than usual, almost alive, but the space was empty. Or so it appeared. My heart thudded in my chest as I turned back to the mirror. The shadow was gone, leaving only my pale reflection staring back at me. That night, as I tried to sleep, the mirror invaded my dreams. I found myself standing in an unfamiliar place, a long, narrow hallway lined with mirrors on both sides. The air was heavy, thick with a metallic scent that made it hard to breathe. Each mirror reflected a distorted version of me, but something was wrong. In one of the reflections, I wasn't alone. A dark, shapeless figure stood behind me, its form shifting like smoke. I turned to look, but the hallway behind me was empty. The figure only existed in the mirrors, and as I moved forward, it grew closer in each reflection, as if it was stalking me. The ground beneath my feet felt strange, soft and damp, as though I was walking on old, rotting wood. Every step echoed unnaturally, the sound bouncing off the mirrors and coming back distorted, as if the space itself was mocking me. I called out, my voice trembling, but the sound died in my throat. The figure in the mirrors tilted its head, as if studying me. Its movements were slow, deliberate, almost curious. But then, it did something that froze the blood in my veins. It raised a hand and placed it against the glass. A single, sharp crack echoed through the hallway as spiderweb fractures spread across the surface of one of the mirrors. I woke with a jolt, gasping for air, drenched in cold sweat. My room was silent, the faint glow of moonlight streaming through the window. But the sense of dread lingered, heavy and suffocating. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just a nightmare. Yet when I looked toward the corner of my room, where the antique mirror now stood, I swore I saw the faint outline of a shadow shifting just beyond the surface. I couldn't sleep the rest of the night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the hallway, the mirrors, and the figure moving closer. The memory of the cracked glass haunted me, its sharp sound ringing in my ears. And worse, I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadow had followed me back into the waking world. What I didn't realize was that the dream was just the beginning. The mirror had opened a door, and something had stepped through. Something that was no longer content to stay confined to its own reflection. The next morning, I walked into my workshop, hoping the daylight would banish the unease that had clung to me since the dream. But the moment I stepped inside, the air felt wrong, thicker, colder, like the room itself was holding its breath. The mirror stood exactly where I had left it, but something about it seemed different. The surface appeared darker, the reflections muted, as if the glass was no longer showing the room as it was but a shadowy, warped version of it. As I began my work, I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. My eyes darted toward the mirror every few minutes, and each time, I swore I saw something moving just out of focus. It wasn't my reflection, it was something deeper, something inside the glass. Then it happened, a small, subtle change that sent a shiver down my spine. A tool I had left on the workbench in front of the mirror was now reflected as lying on the floor, though in reality, it hadn't moved. I froze, staring at the discrepancy, my pulse quickening. I leaned closer to the mirror, examining the reflection. My own image stared back at me, but there was something off. The light in my reflection was dimmer, the shadows deeper. Then I noticed it, an object in the background of the reflection that didn't exist in my workshop. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable, a black door, barely visible in the depths of the glass. Before I could process what I was seeing, a faint sound broke the silence. It wasn't coming from the room, but from the mirror itself. A low, rhythmic tapping, as if someone or something was on the other side, trying to get out. I backed away, my heart pounding, but the sound grew louder, sharper, until it echoed through the room. Then it stopped, leaving an unbearable silence in its wake. I forced myself to turn away and focus on my work, convincing myself it was all in my head. Hours passed, and the unease slowly ebbed, replaced by the monotony of routine. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and the workshop was bathed in twilight, the atmosphere shifted again. The shadows seemed to stretch, crawling up the walls, and the mirror became an oppressive presence, dominating the room. Then came the moment that shattered any doubt I had left. As I reached for a tool near the mirror, I saw it, clear and unmistakable. My reflection didn't move. My hand hovered inches from the surface, but my reflection stood still, its eyes locked onto mine. My stomach churned with fear as the figure in the mirror began to shift, its features blurring, distorting. Slowly it smiled, not a kind smile, but something cold, predatory. I stumbled backward, nearly knocking over a stack of tools. My breath came in shallow gasps as the figure in the mirror stepped forward, pressing its hand against the glass. For a moment, I thought it might break through, but instead, the surface rippled like water. The shadow that had haunted my dream now stood fully formed behind the reflection, its head tilted in that same unnerving way, as if it was studying me. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The mirror returned to normal, the shadow and distorted reflection gone. But the silence that followed was deafening, heavier than before. I could feel its presence lingering, watching, waiting. I didn't sleep that night, and for the first time, I began to wonder if restoring the mirror had been a terrible mistake. The nightmare wasn't just confined to my dreams anymore. Whatever was in that mirror had found a way to reach me, and I was beginning to fear that it wouldn't stop until it had taken something far more valuable than my reflection. The breaking point came on the fourth night. By then, I had barely slept, haunted by the shadow in every reflective surface I passed. The mirror seemed to pulse with life, its presence growing more oppressive with each passing hour. That evening, as I sat in my workshop trying to distract myself with routine, the lights flickered once, twice, then went out completely. The darkness swallowed the room, save for a faint, eerie glow emanating from the mirror. It was no longer just reflecting the room. It was radiating an unnatural, silvery light, casting shifting shadows across the walls. My heart thundered in my chest as I grabbed a flashlight, but the beam barely penetrated the darkness surrounding the mirror. Slowly, I approached, every step echoing unnaturally, as though the room had expanded into a cavernous void. The closer I got, the colder the air became, until it felt like ice was forming on my skin. Then I saw it. At first, it was subtle, a ripple across the surface of the mirror, like a pond disturbed by an unseen hand. But as I watched, the ripple grew into a swirling vortex, the glass distorting and twisting until it no longer resembled a mirror at all. It had become a window, and beyond it was a realm of utter darkness, punctuated by faint, flickering lights that seemed to hover and dance like dying stars. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the void, a silhouette darker than the surrounding blackness. It moved toward the surface with a deliberate, almost predatory grace, and as it came closer, I could make out its features, or rather the lack of them. Its face was a smooth, blank expanse, except for two deep voids where eyes should have been. The voids were alive, swirling with shadows that seemed to draw me in, pulling at the edges of my mind. I wanted to run, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. The figure raised a hand, and as it touched the surface of the mirror, the glass cracked, sending jagged lines shooting outward like veins of lightning. The sound was deafening, a sharp, visceral crack that reverberated through the workshop and into my very bones. Then the figure spoke, not with words, but with a voice that echoed inside my head, low and guttural, resonating with ancient malice. "You opened the door. Now you cannot close it." Before I could react, the cracks in the mirror began to glow, each fissure burning with an intense, otherworldly light. The room was flooded with the smell of scorched metal, and the shadows on the walls began to move, detaching themselves from objects, growing and shifting until they surrounded me. I could feel them brushing against my skin, cold and insubstantial, yet heavy with intent. In a panic, I turned to run, but the shadows blocked my path, hurting me toward the mirror. My own reflection stared back at me, but it wasn't mimicking my movements. It was moving independently, its eyes wide with terror, mirroring the fear I felt but couldn't express. As I watched, my reflection began to change, its features twisting into something grotesque and alien, until it no longer resembled me at all. The vortex within the mirror grew stronger, pulling at the edges of reality itself. Objects in the room began to lift off the ground, drawn toward the glass. My own body felt the pull, an invisible force dragging me closer. I fought against it, clinging to the edge of a table, but the shadows wrapped around my arms and legs, cold and relentless. In a final act of desperation, I screamed, the sound ripping from my throat as I was pulled toward the mirror. The moment my hand touched the glass, everything went silent. The world around me dissolved, and I found myself standing in a void, a place where time and space seemed meaningless. The figure from the mirror stood before me, its eyeless gaze boring into my soul. "This is only the beginning," it whispered, its voice like a distant storm. Then with a sudden jolt, I was back in my workshop, lying on the floor, gasping for air. The mirror was shattered, its fragments scattered across the room. But the silence that followed was worse than the chaos. It was heavy, suffocating, as if the air itself was holding its breath. I thought it was over, but as I stood, I noticed something horrifying. Etched into the largest shard of the mirror was the same symbol I had seen in my dream, glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. And in its reflection, I saw not myself, but the shadow, standing silently waiting. The days that followed were a blur of fear and confusion. The shattered mirror was gone. I had swept the pieces into a box and locked it away in a storage cabinet, hoping that out of sight might mean out of mind. But the shadows persisted, appearing at the edges of my vision, lingering in the corners of my home. It wasn't just my imagination. I could feel their presence, a cold, oppressive weight that seemed to press down on me no matter where I went. Desperate for answers, I began researching the mirror. I contacted the collector, who had commissioned its restoration, but his phone was disconnected. Frustrated, I turned to the local archives, digging through old records and photographs. It didn't take long for the pieces to fall into place, and what I uncovered made my blood run cold. The mirror, as it turned out, wasn't just any antique. It had once belonged to the Van Richten family, a prominent household in the 1800s that had fallen into infamy. Their estate had burned to the ground under mysterious circumstances, and whispers of occult practices and strange disappearances surrounded their legacy. But the most chilling detail was a portrait I found in an old newspaper clipping, a photograph of the family standing before the mirror. In the photo, the mirror reflected not the family but something else. The faint outline of a shadowy figure loomed in the glass, barely visible but undeniably present. My stomach churned as I recognized the shape. It was the same shadow that had haunted my dreams, that I had seen in the reflection before the mirror shattered. Then I found something even worse, a journal written by one of the Van Richten children, preserved in the archives. The entries began innocently enough, describing the mirror as a gift from a distant relative and marveling at its beauty. But as the entries continued, they grew darker, more frantic. The child described seeing a man made of shadows in the glass, who whispered secrets and promised to show them what lies beyond. The final entry was barely legible, scrawled in shaky handwriting. The shadow is in the house now. It follows me, even when I'm not near the mirror. I hear it in the walls. It wants me to choose, but I don't understand the question. God help me, I'm so cold. A chill crept down my spine as I closed the journal. The sense of dread that had followed me since that night in the workshop was now unbearable. This wasn't just an artifact, it was a doorway, and I had opened it. Worse, I was beginning to notice patterns that connected the mirror's history to my own life. Years ago, as a child, I had recurring nightmares about shadows. I had dismissed them as childhood fears, but now they came rushing back with horrifying clarity. In one dream, I stood in front of a mirror that wasn't in my home. Behind my reflection, a dark figure loomed, its hollow eyes fixed on me. My parents told me I had screamed myself awake that night, but I had never been able to recall why, until now. Digging deeper, I found a chilling connection. The symbol etched into the shards of the shattered mirror-matched carvings found in the ruins of the Van Richten estate. It wasn't just a decorative motif. It was a sigil, a mark used in rituals meant to bridge the worlds. My nightmares, the mirror, and the shadow, they weren't random. They were tied together, part of a pattern that spanned generations. My next step was clear, though every instinct screamed at me to stop. I had to visit the site of the Van Richten estate. The journal hinted at a final place, a location where the mirror had first been hung. Perhaps there, I would find answers, or an end to the nightmare. As I packed a bag, a faint whisper echoed in the room, a voice so quiet I almost missed it. "You're already too late." I froze, my breath caught in my throat. Turning slowly, I saw the faintest outline of a figure in the reflection of a darkened window. It didn't move, didn't threaten, it just stood there waiting. For what? I didn't know. But one thing was clear. The mirror wasn't the end of this mystery. It was only the beginning. The Van Richten estate was nothing more than a husk of its former self, a crumbling ruin swallowed by overgrown woods. The path leading there was almost impassable, choked with vines and tangled roots that seemed to claw at my feet, as if the earth itself was warning me to turn back. But I pressed on, the weight of the journal in my bag reminding me why I was there. The deeper I went, the heavier the air became, filled with a metallic tang that clung to my throat. When I finally reached the remains of the estate, the sight was both eerie and strangely familiar. The foundation of the mansion still stood, its charred stone walls blackened by fire, but there was something about the layout that sent a shiver down my spine. It felt as if I had seen it before, not in pictures or descriptions, but in dreams. The center of the ruin was dominated by a large, circular stone platform, cracked and weathered with time. In its center was the faint outline of the same symbol etched into the mirror's shards. I wasn't alone. The sensation of being watched was overwhelming, pressing down on me from all sides. Shadows moved at the edges of my vision, darting between the crumbled walls and the encroaching trees. At first, I thought they might be animals, but there was no sound, no rustling leaves, no snapping twigs. Just silence. I set down my bag and pulled out the journal, flipping to the final pages. The writing described a room beneath the estate, accessible through a hidden staircase near the platform. The writer spoke of whispers emanating from the darkness, of cold hands that seemed to guide them forward. My pulse quickened as I realized that I had no choice but to follow the same path. It took hours to find the entrance, a narrow stone stairwell hidden beneath a pile of rubble. As I descended, the temperature plummeted. My breath turned to mist, and the metallic scent grew stronger, almost suffocating. The walls were damp, covered in dark stains that I didn't dare examine too closely. The whispers began softly at first, faint murmurs that could have been the wind. But as I descended deeper, they grew louder, more distinct. Words I couldn't understand echoed all around me, spoken in a language that seemed older than time itself. At the bottom of the stairs, I found myself in a cavernous chamber. The air was thick with a presence I couldn't see but could feel, an oppressive force that seemed to press against my chest, making it hard to breathe. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, and atop it was an object covered by a tattered cloth. My hands trembled as I reached out, pulling the cloth away to reveal an ancient, cracked mirror. The glass was cloudy, its surface marred by fractures that seemed to pulse with faint, dark light. As I stared, the whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence. Then, the mirror began to ripple, and my reflection appeared, but it wasn't alone. The shadow stood behind me, clearer than ever before. Its eyeless face stared at me, and though it had no mouth, I could feel it smiling. "You've come far," the voice echoed, though its lips never moved. "But this is where you decide." The mirror's surface shifted, revealing scenes from my life. Moments I had forgotten, choices I had made, some small, others life-altering. And then something impossible. I saw memories I didn't recognize, events that hadn't happened yet. In one, I stood in a room, my face pale with terror, as the shadow loomed behind me. In another, I was lying on the ground, surrounded by shards of broken glass, my eyes lifeless. The shadow stepped closer, its form towering over me. "Choose," it said, the word reverberating through the cavern. "Stay and become one of us, or leave and carry the darkness with you. Either way, the door remains open." I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to move. The mirror's surface continued to shift, showing scenes of others who had stood where I now stood. Their faces were twisted with fear, their reflections distorted as the shadow consumed them. The symbol on the mirror's frame began to glow, its light growing brighter and brighter until it was all I could see. Then, everything went dark. I awoke hours later, or perhaps days. It was impossible to tell. I was lying outside the ruins, the journal clutched in my hand. The air was heavy with the scent of rain, though the sky was clear. My mind raced, trying to piece together what had happened, but the memory of the shadow's voice lingered, its final words echoing in my ears. "You carry it now. Wherever you go, it follows." As I stumbled away from the estate, I realized that the choice I had made didn't matter. The shadow wasn't bound to the mirror anymore, it was bound to me. And no matter where I went, no matter how far I ran, I knew it would always be there, waiting in the darkness, watching from the edges of my reflection. The days after my return from the Van Richten estate were a waking nightmare. My reflection no longer belonged to me. Every glance into a mirror, a window, or even a puddle revealed the shadow lingering just behind me, its presence clearer and closer than ever before. It didn't move as I did. Instead, it watched, its eyeless face fixed on me, as though waiting for something. My sleep was plagued with dreams of the ruined estate, the cavernous chamber, and the ancient mirror that now haunted my every waking moment. One night, I awoke to a strange sound, an incessant tapping, faint but rhythmic, echoing through my apartment. At first, I thought it was coming from outside, but as I sat up, I realized the sound was coming from the mirror in my bedroom. My blood turned to ice as I saw it. The glass, though untouched since the estate, was rippling like water, the faint outline of a hand pressing against it from the other side. Summoning every ounce of courage I had left, I approached the mirror. My reflection stared back at me, pale and gaunt, but the shadow was nowhere to be seen. For the first time in days, I thought I was alone. But then the tapping stopped, and a voice, low, guttural, and impossibly cold, spoke from the glass. "It's time." The mirror's surface cracked violently, spiderweb fractures spreading across the glass. A sudden force pulled at me, dragging me toward the mirror as if an invisible hand had reached through and seized me. I fought against it, gripping the edge of my dresser, but the pull was relentless. As I was drawn closer, the fractures began to glow, emitting a blinding, silver light that swallowed the room. When the light faded, I was no longer in my bedroom. I stood in a vast, empty expanse, a world of shadows and reflections. The ground beneath my feet was smooth and cold, like polished obsidian, and the air was thick with a metallic tang that made it hard to breathe. All around me, countless mirrors floated in the darkness, each one reflecting a distorted version of myself. The shadow stepped out of one of the mirrors, its form towering over me. This time, it wasn't content to linger at the edges of my vision. It moved closer, its head tilting as it examined me with a curiosity that felt almost human. "You have walked too far, Elias," it said, its voice reverberating through the space like thunder. "You've opened the door and crossed the threshold. Now you must choose." Suddenly, one of the mirrors changed. It showed a scene from my childhood, a memory I had long forgotten. I was standing in front of a mirror in my childhood home, crying as a dark figure loomed behind me. My parents rushed into the room, pulling me away, but in the reflection, I saw the shadow smile for the first time. Other mirrors began to shift, showing moments from my life I didn't recognize, events that hadn't happened yet. In one, I stood in a hospital room, surrounded by doctors who looked at me with hollow eyes. In another, I was lying in a forest, the shadow standing over me, its hand reaching for my chest. "These are your futures," the shadow said, "each one tied to a choice you will make. But only one will lead you out." The mirrors began to circle me, spinning faster and faster, their reflections blurring together into a whirlwind of light and darkness. My head pounded as the shadow stepped closer, raising a hand toward me. "You can stay here, become one of us, and end the cycle. Or you can leave, but the door will remain open, and the darkness will follow you. The choice is yours." I was paralyzed, my mind racing as I tried to understand the implications of the shadow's words. Staying meant losing myself entirely, becoming part of this twisted world. But leaving meant condemning others to the same fate, knowing that the shadow would find another victim. In a moment of desperation, I reached for the nearest mirror, shattering its surface with my fist. The fragments fell to the ground, each shard reflecting the shadow's face. The air vibrated with an otherworldly hum as the shadow recoiled, its form distorting and flickering like a dying flame. "Fool," it hissed, its voice filled with rage. "You cannot destroy what has no end." The mirrors around me shattered all at once, their fragments spiraling into the darkness. The ground beneath me began to crack, glowing with the same silver light I had seen in my bedroom. The pull returned, stronger this time, dragging me toward the fissures in the ground. And then I was back. I woke on the floor of my workshop, the shattered shards of the antique mirror scattered around me. My hand throbbed with pain, blood dripping from the cuts on my knuckles. But something was different. The shadows were gone, or so I thought. As I stood, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in one of the shards. For a moment, it was just me, tired and broken. But then, just behind my reflection, the shadow appeared, faint but unmistakable. It wasn't gone. It had followed me back, and now it was waiting, watching, for the next door to open. "You chose poorly," the voice whispered, so faint I almost thought I imagined it. But deep down, I knew the truth. The nightmare wasn't over. It had only just begun. Since that night, nothing has been the same. I've tried to convince myself it's over, that I escaped whatever nightmare the mirror had trapped me in. But deep down, I know the truth. The shadow didn't stay behind in that strange, dark world. It came with me, and now it's here, always just out of sight, lingering at the edges of my life. At first, I thought I was imagining things. A flicker of movement in a darkened window, the faint outline of a figure reflected in a puddle. But then the signs became impossible to ignore. Lights flicker when I enter a room, shadows stretch unnaturally long across the walls, and every mirror I pass feels like a gateway waiting to reopen. The faint scent of burning wax, the same metallic tang that filled the air in the mirror's realm, now haunts my apartment, clinging to my clothes, my furniture, my skin. The worst part is the symbol. It started as a faint outline etched into my wrist, almost invisible. But over the days, it's grown darker, pulsing faintly with a light that only I can see. Sometimes, when I'm alone, I can feel it burn, as if the shadow is trying to remind me that it's still there, still waiting. I've tried everything to rid myself of it. I threw the shattered pieces of the mirror into the river, only to find a single shard lying on my doorstep the next morning, pristine and untouched. I've burned sage, consulted psychics, and even reached out to priests. None of it works. The shadow remains patient and silent, its presence growing heavier with each passing day. Then came the dreams. They're no longer confined to my sleep. I see glimpses of them when I close my eyes, even for a moment. A hallway of mirrors stretching into infinity, the shadow standing at the far end, its hand raised as if beckoning me closer. Sometimes I hear it whisper my name in the dead of night, a voice like wind rushing through a hollow cave. Last night, I woke to find my reflection standing in the mirror at the foot of my bed. It didn't move when I did. It just stared at me, its expression blank, its eyes slowly darkening until they became voids, two empty pits that seemed to draw all the light from the room. Behind it, the shadow appeared, its form towering and oppressive, its hollow face twisted into a grin. And then it spoke. "You left the door open. Others will come." I don't know what it meant, but I can feel the truth of its words. The events that began with the mirror haven't ended. They've only spread. Sometimes I see people on the street pausing before reflective surfaces, their faces pale as they turn away quickly, their hands shaking. It's as if the shadow isn't just watching me anymore. It's watching everyone. The symbol on my wrist grows stronger each day, its faint glow becoming more vivid in the dark. I've started to wonder if it's not just a mark but a key, a tether binding me to whatever lies beyond the mirrors. I've tried to resist the urge to look, but it's becoming harder. Every mirror feels like a doorway, and I can't shake the feeling that one day I'll have to step through it again. The question that haunts me most is this: was I chosen, or did I choose this? The shadow's words echo in my mind. You carry it now. Did I make a mistake, or was this fate? And if the door truly is open, how many others will it pull in before it's closed? I've shared my story with you because I need to know, has this happened to anyone else? Have you ever felt like something was watching you, something not of this world? Have you seen the shadow in your own reflection? If you have, don't ignore it. Don't dismiss it as your imagination. The mirrors are more than what they seem. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Share your experiences if you've had anything similar happen to you. And if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel. This is only one of the stories I've uncovered about the strange and unexplainable, and there are more waiting to be told. But a word of warning, if you've made it this far, don't look in the mirror tonight. Because sometimes, the things you see staring back aren't really you. And once they've seen you, they don't forget. The shadow is here. It's watching. And it's waiting.